this masterclass where we will be talking about the mental health impact of climate change, understanding the connection. Some housekeeping matters. This session will be recorded, which you can later access from our YouTube channel. Please do share this with anyone that would be interested. You can also press on the show captions button at the bottom of the screen should you wish to access captions for this session. And once the presentation is over, please feel free to unmute yourself and interact with our guest speaker. And you can also raise your hand and type in the question as well on the chat box. And we hope to make it an interactive session and learn from each other because we've got a very interesting topic today. A quick introduction of our speaker, Raj Mariwala. Raj is a director at Mariwala Health Initiative, an advocacy, capacity building, and grant-making organization focusing on accessible mental health for marginalized communities. Currently, Raj is also a board member of Parcham, a not-for-profit that works with young marginalized women on human rights, equity, and social justice. They're also a practicing canine and feline behaviorist. Raj, thank you again for taking out your valuable time. We know how busy you are. Over to you.
Thanks so much for having me to talk about this important topic. It's absolutely lovely to be here and talking about this topic that is very close to my heart. But because I'm not sure about everyone's access needs from people participating today, and we do have captions, I will share a description of myself because people who are not blind and who are on this call have some visual information about me. And so I'll share it for anyone else on call who may need it. I'm Raj, I'm the director of Mariwala Health Initiative. I have short, mostly black hair, and I'm wearing a green shirt. So now that that's out of the way, I am going to be speaking from my position as someone who works in mental health. And thank you for that introduction. Currently, we work with 33 partners on 42 projects across 21 states in India, across a range of interventions, services, advocacy, as well as training. Okay. And my last bit of housekeeping before I really start is that in case I say things that disturb you or upset you, in case you need some support, you can reach out to iCall Helpline, which offers professional psychosocial support in 8 languages. And the number is 915-298-7821, or you can email at icall@tis.edu, and I can share these a little later on in the chat. But let's start off. And I think I'm going to start off by addressing what I hear pretty often. And I think most people say that I didn't realize that there's a link between climate change and mental health. Now, both these areas have seen quite a lot of attention and discussion in the last 2 to 3 years. And so I'm going to start us off with a small exercise. And can all of you just type in the chat box the first few words or thoughts that enter your head when I say mental health? And we'll take like a minute to do so. I hope chat is, oh yes, okay, chat is live. So please type anything. There are no right or wrong answers. Like literally, what are the first words that come into your head when I say mental health? Okay, happiness, well-being, emotions, thoughts, feelings, environment. Excellent. Mental health is a state of feeling okay and normal. Great. Stage of being. Wow, this is a very interesting set of responses. I have never received this type of response, let me tell you. Community, peace, conflict, balance, presence of mind. Any other words? And like, don't be scared. Like I said, there's no right or wrong. Stress management, resolution. Okay. Thanks all for participating. Negotiation. Yeah. So this is a very unique audience, and I'm very glad to have it. Usually, when I ask people this question, people tend to respond by saying depression, anxiety, bipolar disorders, naming conditions. Okay. And I'll explain why that's important, why I'm asking, why I asked you all to do this exercise, but clearly we're already ahead of the curve for this conversation. Uh, can we do a similar exercise for climate change? What are the words that come into your head right off the bat when I say climate change? Again, we'll take like a minute. Migration, resilience, sea levels rising, great stuff. Extreme weather, vulnerability, yes. Climate extremities, heat waves, temperature rising from 1.5 to 4 degrees, livelihoods, diseases, food scarcity, drought. Amazing. Thank you for the response. Disasters. Any final ones before I stress and stigma? Great. Okay. So many of these words tell us, and also the intersection of the two, tell us something important. It tells us what the dominant discourse, the dominant knowledge is around both of these fields. And because I said that, you guys are quite different, mostly when I get this response and I hear bipolar, depression, anxiety, uh, it's what I call an expert-led response. The conversation in the field is about diagnoses, is about conditions, it's technical. Now, when we spoke, when you all shared some words on climate change, there were a few technical words and some non-technical words as well. But by and large, everyone on the group seems to have a very accessible and a good understanding, a viewpoint to climate change and mental health both. But what's out there, what we read in the papers, what we read in maybe academic journals, largely is a top-down scientific expert approach. And I'm going to do something first, which is actually to do some perspective building around the intersection of the two, because it's very important to look at this top-down scientific expert approach a little closely, because it obscures some of the linkages that crop up when mental health intersects with climate change. And so to start off, I'll first start with a definition of mental health. There is a biomedical definition of mental health, which not a single person on the chat mentioned, which is a focus on conditions or particular mental illnesses. And these are typically described as having a set of symptoms, like a physical illness would. And then, of course, following from symptoms, there's the idea of treatment, which is pharma, allopathic, or talk therapy. And finally, success, which is a reduction or disappearance of symptoms, right? Now, this centers the biomedical, and thinking about this as diagnoses and then thinking about the solutions as either talk therapy or psychiatry, kind of obscures a very important factor, which is mental health cannot be seen in isolation of people's lives and contexts. Now, unfortunately, I think COVID really showed us how mental health is impacted by and also impacts so many social, economic, and political factors. So now you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say so many migrant groups faced distress during COVID. Or, for example, maybe you read in the papers that women stuck in homes faced domestic violence, but further distress from that domestic violence because they were unable to leave the house and they were unable to access their usual support systems, right? And so when we're talking about the intersection of climate change and mental health, it's very important to go with the understanding that our context, our social context, influences and interacts with the psychological, that is emotions, thoughts, feelings. I think Kajal wrote that in the chats or something like this. So for example, in a context such as India, financial strain, the increased exposure to maybe violence, to food insecurity, linked to poverty, combined with a reduced access to social safety nets, all increases the likelihood of people experiencing distress and developing mental health issues. The opposite is also true. If you do live with a mental health condition, it affects your education, your livelihood, and more. So, looking at the intersection of mental health and climate change, keep in mind that poor mental health is a development issue. It's a cause and a consequence of poverty, compromised education, gender inequality, physical ill health, violence, and other similar global challenges. Now, in case y'all are wondering, is this something new? Why haven't we heard this before? It's just because our mainstream knowledge is quite Eurocentric. And when I say Eurocentric, I mean white, Western centered. So we need to move away from that lens if we are to look at the intersection of climate change and mental health. And we must use what we call a psychosocial lens. So now in terms of like development speak, how does this inform solutions? Or I don't like the word solution, so I'll use the word intervention. How does this inform interventions across a wide range of things, including climate change? It has to inform interventions around housing, education, legal support, skill building. And once you see all of these as part of a mental health response, you will know that this leads to better mental health outcomes. So even before I start talking about the intersection, I want everyone to remember that you cannot consider mental health in isolation from other areas of development, such as education, employment, human rights, disaster response of all sorts, which of course includes extreme weather events, climate change. Now, the conversation, I think, on climate change has also intensified as it has on mental health over the last 3 years. And partly, honestly, I think it's because it's impacted developed countries a whole lot more. But that's not always been the case, right? Extreme weather events are not new in many parts of the world. Heat waves have been around in quite a few countries. Extreme weather events, natural disasters are not new. And we know this already. We know that low and middle income countries are more vulnerable to the repercussions of climate change. But did you also know that more than 80% of people living with mental illness live in low and middle income countries? So that's one very important intersection right there. Already we are saying that we are at the center of the intersection of these two things, right? And we're talking about climate change like it's something relatively new, something that's, I don't know, people weren't taking notice of it in the last 5 to 6 years. But already, if we take the example of Bangladesh, for example, 135 million people in Bangladesh have been affected by climate-related disasters in the last 20 years. And that includes, loss of life, injury, disabling illnesses, and homelessness. Similarly, so with other countries in the West, I don't want to, that's why I mentioned white Western, like Haiti, Malawi, have also cyclically suffered because their systems were unable to address droughts, hurricanes, and floods, resulting in obviously widespread distress. Now, as we build perspective to understand the intersection, like I said, discourse is white Western dominated. But the second thing is that the most visible narratives, the most visible research, the most visible documentation is also documentation that happens to be the most privileged. That's why I said Western countries are talking about heat waves all of a sudden, right? And that's because they are more visible. And this happens when you slice it at any level, whether I'm talking global north and global south, or whether I know that today on TV, floods in Bombay will make national news more so than a full-fledged disaster in Assam. We know it. Similarly, conversations around workplace mental health center around whom? White collar employees working in fancy offices with ACs in major metros. So I'm going to use examples to explain this intersection, right? So what happens at the intersections of livelihoods, climate, and mental health? Again, this is, I'm sure everyone on the call knows this. Nearly 60,000 Indian farmers and farm workers have died by suicide over the past 3 decades. Now, these are just reported figures, and they don't include women farmers because they aren't categorized as farmers. So, see what I mean again about privilege and which narratives are visible to us, right? Um, Similarly, mental health academia and literature, and I know that people are interested in this term, explores the concepts of eco-anxiety, which is fear, which is defined as fear of environmental destruction and climate disasters. Okay. And it's written about as fear that happens especially amongst young people. Now, this is two things. One is it's a biomedical approach. They're saying that young individuals may be feeling this anxiety, may be feeling this fear. So it's individual. And more importantly, it's almost looking toward the future. So if you Google climate anxiety and Google and see what comes up in Indian newspapers, you'll find this definition, right? But try saying this to a person who is from coastal Odisha, who is about 30 years old right now. The likelihood of that person having already faced an extreme weather event, having been displaced from their home, is already extremely high. So that's what I mean when I say that we have to be really careful when we look at the literature out there, because it does not capture many experiences. And the fear of climate change, the fear of extreme weather events happening, is something that happens only in certain more privileged communities in the West. It's already happened here in India. And we know this, many youth in low and middle income countries, take Assam, for example. They've been living through natural hazards with interrupted education, trauma, and loss, right? And these are just major life disruptions. When you look at it from a mental health lens, that cause large scale distress, forced migration, and actually things that are defined currently as climate anxiety, which is observation of climate change effects, or it's also called non-specific worry. These don't hold. And part of our problem is this: we just don't have enough research coming from our context, from our situation, right? So, like I said, the default approach to both these fields misses out the fact that there is this young person in coastal Odisha. And that's what I'm going to call a systemic failure. And both the fields have it, right? Climate change has it, mental health also has it. And the systemic failure is this, that it's very Eurocentric. It has a top-down scientific expert approach, which also leads to it being seen as an individual phenomena. It's not. We know that climate change is not, yes, it's experienced individually, but the collective impacts are also massive. And there are deep interlinkages to both mental health and climate change and policy failure. Why is it that not that many lives are lost when there's a hurricane in the US or in Canada and Australia? They have warning systems, they have policies in place, they have rehab, they have disaster response. Part of it is a big policy lapse when it comes to climate change in many locations, in many LMICs, and similarly so for mental health. We are supposed to have a person, a psychiatrist, sitting in each and every district hospital in the country today. And we are nowhere close to even having 50% of the district hospitals being staffed, right? So importantly, now if I'm critiquing this approach, this dominant top-down expert-led approach, what am I going to replace it with, or what else will I use to engage with this intersection? If I'm to learn more, if I'm to see what the big gaps are in policy, what the big gaps are in research, what the gaps are in intersections with other fields, I'm going to say that if we want to be effective at addressing the intersection of the two, we need to look at how climate change and mental health disproportionately affects the well-being of the people at the margins of society. And who's that? Indigenous and rural communities, disabled people, queer trans people, those who live with marginalized caste and race locations, and working class communities. Now, we already know that there are certain communities that are more vulnerable to climate change, but when mental health and climate change intersect, the vulnerability is further magnified. Okay, and I'll share some examples now. So there are some. Remember, I spoke to you about workplace mental health, right? And I said it's only white collar workers that we are talking about. So I'm going to use an example from workplace mental health. Now, there are documented effects of occupational heat stress faced by workers. Now, already, unfortunately, mental health effects or psychological effects are not as well documented as physical health effects. And there are very few examples from India because industries haven't allowed people to go in and ask their workers. But there was a large scale study done in Thailand, okay? And they found that psychological distress from heat stress affected people at work quite seriously, but not just at work, also in traveling to work, because in traveling to work, that is also hard because they don't have streamlined transport. In fact, one recent report from Thailand showed that heat stress is a very serious problem in a range of work settings, be it in construction, manufacturing, farming labor, right? They also saw linkages between heat stress, kidney disease, and psychological distress. And in fact, another study that was done said that any pre-existing mental health problems that workers had when combined with heat stress tripled the risk of mortality during a heat wave, right? And obviously, what they found is the increased risk of the impact on physical and mental health also had social and economic impacts, because some people had to reduce their daily income because the heat slowed their work output. The more hazardous the job, the greater was the impact on mental health when it came to extreme weather. Also, what happened is the increased heat stress, the increased psychological distress showed effects in confusion, irritability, and further emotional stress, which then caused workers, especially in manufacturing units, to become distracted from tasks and ignore safety procedures. Now, you can see the knock-on effects of this. And yet, there is little to no conversation about workplace mental health and the intersection with climate change, right? And of course, in this conversation itself, marginalized communities, if we take a look at India, are far more exposed to these systemic vulnerabilities, to these hazards, right? And that just magnifies their vulnerability all the more. So I think about less than 10 days ago, sanitation workers in Bangalore, the parikramas they are called, they asked for half-day leaves because they work from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. without protective gear usually. And can you imagine the distress during a heat wave? They have to work out in the open without access to drinking water, without even access to tap water. And they were forced to pay money to buy bottled plastic mineral water, right? What are the mental health ramifications of that? And why is this never spoken about when it comes to occupational or workplace mental health, right? Similarly, if we look at another example, Kerala, the state, reported that its fishing community was at high risk of suicide due to livelihood concerns from changing marine patterns and disasters. Now, what does this tell us? There's clearly stuff that we don't know about how rural communities, how agrarian and primary societies, such as ours, who are more dependent on primary resources, are at much higher risk due to the combination of natural hazards with a lack of access to healthcare, socioeconomic security, and gaps in policy. Right? So there are some, I'm going to keep on calling out these examples because they need to be studied, they need to be spoken about, and there are many, many ways in which to kind of slice this intersection. Now, getting a little bit more into the mental health uh, part of things, research has already shown us that rising temperatures, deforestation, an increasing number of natural disasters, and the losses that occur after it are resulting in mental health concerns such as depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal ideation, and more. But of course, it's very important to remember that climate change related impacts can lead to job loss, force people to migrate or move, and lead to a loss of social support and community resources. Now, remember when I spoke about context, it's very important to note that all of these things, job loss, forced migration, a lack of social support, all have very serious mental health consequences. So, for example, um, for the Bangladeshi population that survived the 2019 flood, almost 60% of survivors experienced suicidal ideation. And at least 6% made a suicide plan and attempted suicide. Now, that's a very, very serious intersection. And that's simply because um, research has found that significant distress is 2 to 3 times more prevalent in communities or individuals that experience disasters than in the general population. They also found that disaster related distress lingers for a very long time. Now, there was a large scale study done of disaster survivors from 80 countries, and 25% of the survivors said that their distress stopped them from the ability to perform everyday tasks, fulfill family or employment obligations for years afterwards. Okay, now, despite all this evidence of the mental health impact of disasters, disaster response approach has not ever traditionally included mental health services. Unfortunately, a lot of disaster preparedness and response has focused solely on some immediate needs such as water, shelter, food, physical safety, and such, um, discounting the fact that disasters actually are disrupting social networks, affecting livelihoods and community resources. Now, in such situations, persons with mental health conditions may lose access to all their support systems, to modes of care, definitely to medication, which leads to further mental distress. Now, there are some big systemic failures or gaps in disaster response as well. And I'm going to give you some examples. Now, natural hazards are a given. Nature is what nature does, but it's a lot of the times it's our policies, priorities, and systems that turn some hazards into disasters. Now, what happens when disasters further cascade into increased psychosocial vulnerability? Again, example, migrant workers are adversely affected by economic policies, gaps in other types of policies, such as lack of access to stable employment, maybe lack of access to stable housing, social safety nets, education systems, and of course, healthcare. Now, remember that it is institutions, policies, and geopolitical dynamics that increase their vulnerability to disasters, as well as affect access to rehabilitation and support. So here's an example from Bombay, which is where I live. And research for migrants in many places show that migrants oftentimes are left with no option but to settle in ecologically sensitive regions, which places them at a higher risk, obviously, at times of climate hazards. Now, an organization called Yuva created a climate hazards map of Bombay, and that map showed that a lot of informal migrant settlements are located in areas that are sensitive to disasters. The one such settlement is called New Bharatnagar, which is close to the Bhabha Atomic Research Center. Now that area is prone to landslides. It's migrant workers who live there. And during heavy rains, one year, the government decided to build a retaining wall above the bastis. Now in 2021, this retaining wall collapsed one night, obviously causing destruction, injury, and death. Now, in terms of the mental health implications, I barely need to spell these out. There's grief, loss, PTSD, interrupted education, interrupted livelihood, and of course, lack of access to shelter. In fact, what has been documented is that even as time has passed, 1 year, 2 years, and this was seen in Kerala as well and in Odisha, community members may react to the sound of rain on the roof. Community members will have many sleepless nights in case it's raining, because the idea is that what if I need to escape all of a sudden to save my life, right? And of course, not to mention lack of government action to clear the debris. Now the debris has stayed there well over a year past the incident. Now add to this a complete lack of formal mental health support. Now let's take the example of this one migrant basti, okay? And let's look at the interlinkages between climate change, mental health, poverty, homelessness, and mental illness due to this one incident. Now, the likelihood of living with a mental illness is 3 times greater for persons without a roof over their heads as compared to the general population. The psychological dimensions of homelessness or losing your home in a disaster are high levels of stress, uncertainty, anxiety, and possibly exposure to a greater level of violence, whether from people around you or from the government, unemployment, lack of access to education, and especially for young persons, adverse childhood experiences. Maybe some of you have read more recently about a fire that happened in a slum community in Malad, Bombay, in which daily wage workers were reporting that they didn't go to work. They didn't earn their daily money because they had to guard whatever meager possessions were saved from the fire. Now, what happens in such cases when you face a disaster, whether it is in New Bharatnagar or whether it is in a slum, you haven't been able to earn income. It's likely to have a knock-on effect and result in food insecurity, which is a risk factor for both mental and physical health. And apart from the immediate physical results of food insecurity, there is unrelenting distress, anxiety, shame, powerlessness, and guilt. So consequently, what happens then is that it's linked to a higher probability of non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, but also much higher probability of having depression and anxiety. And going along this same perspective building and looking at who bears the brunt of this intersection, LGBTQIA or queer trans communities often face homelessness as is, with or without disasters, because maybe discrimination in housing, families abandon them. Now, this often results again in people settling in geographical areas that are unstable or prone to climate disasters. And what happened there? After the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, The Arvanis, who are a trans community, a historical trans community in Tamil Nadu, they were denied access to shelters, they were denied access to rehab, and they were also, their deaths were also not recognized in death records. They faced abuse and harassment from officials, from the system, as well as violence and sexual abuse. So now to spell out what would happen here: sense of hopelessness, lack of support from both state and family, which has very dire consequences. And this type of gender-based violence after a disaster leads to depression, anxiety, stigma, shame, and of course, putting one at a further risk for increased risk for mental health conditions. Again, because I'm using examples to do this perspective building, I don't want you to see them only as examples. They're also very important arenas to look at when it comes to policy, when it comes to research, when it comes to documenting what is happening at the intersection between climate change and mental health. So another group that's left out quite frequently in this is disabled persons. And I'm talking physical disabilities or invisible disabilities. They're the world's largest minority, with 15% of the global population. That's 30 million people who live with a mental or a physical disability. In India, the number is 3 crores. But what happened during cyclones in Orissa? Early warning systems saved many lives, but deaf people were unable to access them, right? Similarly, so in cyclone Amphan in Bangladesh, disabled women unable to use washrooms in certain shelters, or they were unable to use washrooms because they were facing harassment and abuse. And so here's the important intersection. There's increasing evidence that disabled individuals face a higher risk of experiencing mental health concerns such as depression and PTSD, as well as a higher risk of suicidality when left in a vulnerable position after a disaster. Add to that the feeling of being a burden, and the general stigma around disability means that after disasters, either pre or post, disabled individuals feel hesitant to ask for help, to ask for specific access, specific support when it comes to their disability. And a lack of access to medication, which we all know happens, it happened during COVID as well, heightens this stress further. And I've been giving a lot of examples from low and middle income countries. I've been talking a lot about low and middle income countries, but it's not a simple global north, global south equation. Let's take indigenous or Adivasi communities. Now, whether in Europe, USA, or Adivasi tribal communities in India, there's actually documented from the West mainly historical trauma and loss associated with climate change for indigenous communities, because they're very deeply connected to their ecosystems. Now, research has documented the phenomenon of ecological grief associated with the loss of connection to land and place, as well as ecological changes over time. Now, that's led to what has been called complex grief within indigenous communities. Again, this is coming from the West, but I don't think, it's a big gap where India is concerned. And we know that indigenous communities in India have faced this as much, be it during British time and continuing into present day, right? So what does this mean? What does this intersection mean when we look at indigenous or Adivasi tribal communities? The disruptions to the sense of place and associated ecosystem have had very harmful effects on cultural connectedness, sense of identity, dependability of indigenous traditional knowledge, a lot of which is ecological, and of course, the way of life. In terms of the mental health consequences, in indigenous communities, there are linkages to substance dependency, suicidal ideation, high general distress, depression, and social isolation. In fact, in many indigenous communities, there has been documented a sense of pervasive hopelessness. due to maybe land being taken away from them for something extractive such as mining, logging, oil, or types of infrastructure, right? But again, this is something that we don't know where our context is applicable. All of this has been documented in the West, and it's very clearly a big need gap here in terms of research, in terms of policy. And now that I've spent a fair amount of time doing some perspective building and advocating to take a certain approach, that is, let's look at the margins to see where the gaps are, because these are systemic failures. And once we see what is happening at the margins, working towards a system that engages with that will then cover everyone, rather than starting off at the center, rather than starting off at the point of your white collar workers in AC environments. Why aren't we starting off at other points that allow us to see the whole canvas? It's going to be far harder to move outwards than to come back into the center, right? But anyway, let's talk about two terms that come up quite often in climate change and mental health discourse: resilience and recovery. Now, all the examples I've shared before were on vulnerable persons, vulnerable communities. And so what does like building resilience mean when it comes to that? Is it the absence of vulnerability? No. Vulnerable communities are part of much wider systems, and so our thinking, our approach, our research must stretch beyond just that, and to really use what we learn and to take what the margins experience to center them, because they are the ones who are most affected, so that we can define the roles that policies, health institutions, governments, and other community organizations must play. And connected to that, now research has already documented that it's actually very important when you take mental health to build resilience and to sustain a community's coping capacities during recovery from extreme weather events or climate change. And in fact, research says that it's very important to prioritize mental health when it comes to resilience and recovery. But again, the approach, mental health is quite absent in our public health systems, it's quite absent in our policies. And so if we are to really support communities to lead their own recovery, to lead their own resilience, that's something that needs to be changed. You cannot divorce mental health. You cannot put in a mental health camp at the last moment. It needs to be part of the perspective or the lens building. Now, I know that I've shared a lot of doom and gloom examples. So I'm going to now talk about what this would look like, right? What would an integrated mental health response look like in a variety of ways? Let's start off with the government first. Now, I think most people on the call may be aware that Kerala has experienced serious flooding and landslides in 2018, in 2019, in 2020. Now, the state's mental health care program, it's actually mandated by law, but Kerala's state mental health care program, which is actually well drawn out and housed in community health centers, they already, because the program was in place, they saw their numbers double from 14,000 people coming in for services in 2017 to 25,000 in 2018. Now, most people reported that the 2019 floods had further intensified their post-traumatic stress, increased anxiety, increased depression. So the Kerala government made sure to put in helplines by district that then were accessed by people all over the state and were able to provide psychosocial support to affected persons. I hear a lot about technology. And again, this goes back to my whole kind of talk about scientific or technological expertise on this. what worked best during this, as well as actually in West Bengal during disasters, was that telephone lines, which is technology still, was the most effective way to actually provide mental health support, to provide psychosocial support to people who are affected. And I'm going to stress on this once more. When we look at the intersection of mental health and climate change, our response must always be psychosocial, because interrupted education, interrupted livelihood, all has very many knock-on consequences for mental health. Okay, so the Kerala example is one, is very clearly something that governments can do. It's already written into our laws, and it would be great to have in place for many other states. So let's switch gears and look at what a community organization can do. Now I'm going to give you an example from Odisha, which faces a lot of cyclones, and it's an area in which it's crucial to invest in resilience in disaster-prone locations, right, in the state. Now, one of MHI's partners, and this speaks to some of the work that we do at the intersection of climate change and mental health. One of our partners, Basic Needs India, has worked for decades in some of the disaster-affected regions of Odisha, and they've been working on community-based mental health programs. Now, the idea was to approach disaster prep and response by working with government and by working with communities. So what BNI, our partner, did was they sensitized government. They also trained community volunteers to address the psychosocial need of affected communities. So government officials were trained from the departments of health, child protection, women and child welfare, integrated child development services, alongside community leaders, representatives from community-based organizations, and they received intensive training in psychosocial interventions, which means that, yes, there is some sort of emotional support. It could be some form of basic talk therapy and support, but also linkages to other services that are critical and not necessarily traditional mental health, right? And then there were volunteers who were also trained. They were trained not just in psychosocial support, but also in essential government services and how to link those who needed those services, right? So what happens there? The volunteers are from the communities they live in. They understand these communities well. They know who in the community is disabled. They maybe know who in the community who is pregnant. They're trained to mobilize community members to take ownership of disaster response efforts. They're also trained to encourage people to share experiences, anxieties, and stressors. And so then what happens when there is a disaster, pre or post? Instead of having to rely on external support, the community begins to respond collectively to its own needs. The volunteers are also trained that once there is a disaster, how do we reestablish community support structures and self-help groups that have maybe been temporarily disrupted or disbanded during the wake of a disaster? And so in event that there is a disaster, both sets of trained groups, that is the government group and the community-based volunteers, work together in tandem for 4 months to address community distress. So that's a brilliant example, again, of allowing a community to take charge of its own resilience, its own recovery. Third example, farmers. I did mention occupational stress and climate change, livelihoods, and mental health. Now, farmer suicides is a very stark example of distress. And in the Osmanabad district of Maharashtra, about 34% of farmer suicides in Maharashtra come from Osmanabad. And Osmanabad suffers from drought. Year after year, climate change has affected crops, but also unpredictable markets, and then the debt from year after year of crops being affected has had a massive effect on farmer mental health. So one of MHI's other partners, Shiver Foundation, which takes a psychosocial approach to local farmer distress, trains volunteers who are from the community, who are from farming backgrounds. They train, there's 700 trained people who go door to door, ask people whether they're experiencing distress. They provide psychosocial first aid, they give information on available government schemes, they enable households who are in debt to access cash support, credit, and also farming equipment. So what does this do? This moves away from what we traditionally understand as mental health, going to a clinic, going to a psychiatrist. No, we are not prioritizing the voice of the expert because that's not what's needed here. We are looking at the lived expertise of community-based volunteers to understand the context and to give very targeted care that is accessible to farmers who are facing climate-related distress. And again, then this sort of a model becomes community-led rather than external or outsider-led. And like I said, it's very important. It can't just be talking support. It can't just be a psychiatrist. There are linkages to those, but it's very important also to link to other policies and schemes through workshops, refresher courses. So the team does all that. They learn to identify signs of distress, provide basic counseling. There are awareness sessions that happen in community centers, in schools and colleges. And the whole idea is to build or stitch together a support network that has farming families across the district because this is a problem that affects them all. Which brings me to my next point. Research has shown that collective action has the capacity to help with anxiety and psychological distress from climate change. Large-scale activities can all foster a sense of hope, community connection, and social support, which all engage with two of the big conditions that tend to crop up around climate change and mental health, anxiety and depression. So it goes without saying that there are major gaps in policy and research from where we sit. And so I think there are many questions. As I was writing this up, I had many more questions in my head than I had answers. And so perhaps this is a good time to kind of open up for some discussion on this.
Thank you, Raj. I don't know why you are worried about the session being an hour and a half. I think we should have made it 2 hours. Thank you so
sorry.
much. No, this was absolutely great. All the examples that you gave really put a lot of things into perspective. We'll open the floor to questions. Please, if you can unmute yourself, switch on your cameras, or if that's not possible, please do type in your questions in the chat box.
I have a question, which is if we have to look at systemic support, systemic change to kind of support this issue, what sort of policies exist and what sort of gaps are there in the policy landscape that can affect this? And I'm asking because I work in the advocacy space. So we do a lot of work in terms of trying to get policies implemented. So I would love to know what your thoughts are on policy gaps.
So, I mean, I think the policy gaps are so vast that I'm going to struggle to answer, but I know already from working in mental health that they exist in education, they exist in livelihood, they exist in housing, and overall in the development field. If I have to take one example, mostly people tend to say in any disaster relief, oh yeah, of course, we help men and women. What does a gender lens mean in that case? It's only binary. It is only cis heterosexual women, right? What happens to LGBTQ? Oh, I don't know. But also, when I say that the most privileged narratives are the most kind of visible, it's not just LGBTQI folks that are kind of excluded from this work. It's also women with disabilities, disabled persons overall, Dalit women, Adivasi women. Um, and just to give a linked example, during disaster relief, there were a couple of communities who had much harder time accessing any types of recourse or support due to lack of identification. LGBTQIA communities, Dalit communities, right? So a lot of this is structural, it is systemic. And I mean, the lens will have to cover everything, but I think from the mental health perspective, what I want to say is that we need to be very careful about going down the individualized pathological model to say, okay, this causes anxiety and depression in this person, or this person may live with that. It's actually obscuring some of like the term climate anxiety, the way currently that it's formulated, actually obscures some of the more structural, deeper problems that result in climate change. So I would say in terms of policies, there's a lot out there, but if I have to take like a pick for low hanging fruit, I would say looking at shelter, looking at shelter, housing, livelihoods post disaster. Simple thing as accessing bathrooms. We don't have a single early warning system, for example, for persons with disability. There is no phone line. I just spoke about how telephones are great for psychosocial support. There is no phone line for a deaf person. So yeah, it's a problem of too many gaps rather than.
Hi Raj, I have a question, not question exactly. You mentioned that you have worked with the farmers. Now, I also work in the mental health space, especially in the area of MHPSS and PFA. Uh, have you come across or have you conducted any study that talks about recognizing if these people recognize whether there is a presence of mental health challenges within them or not? Because disaster stricken communities most likely are affected by PTSD. And these problems go unrecognized most of the time because after disaster, there are other logistical issues that take an upper hand. So, have you come across any study or have you conducted any study? You means your organization. Have you done any study where you're recognizing if these early signs are recorded or are they able to understand that we have some sort of a mental health challenge, especially in the women and child population?
Right. So one great thing is that I believe that the organization I spoke about, Shiver, is currently doing a research. I think the second thing is to let us question whether we need a diagnosis to record distress. And again, accessing a diagnosis is also a matter of privilege. Even for someone like me, I live with a mental health condition. I was able to access a diagnosis only when I was 21, and I have all the privileges in the world, right? So I do know that, for example, again, if I have to take Shiver, they do go around from house to house talking about signs of distress. And just to give you one example, I think maybe now this is 2 to 3 years old, this example, but one of the volunteers was going from house to house and talking about recognizing signs of distress. They also have a phone line, right? So they got a call the next day from a 6-year-old boy who had listened to the volunteer and said, "My father is exhibiting these signs," and his father's life was saved because he reached out. So I do know, not just I think from working with farmers, but in other rural contexts that may be low resourced, that people in their own context are very clearly able to articulate uh, distress that they may be feeling. Is it going to easily fit into our knowledge or understanding or the textbook definition of depression and anxiety? I don't know. One, because I'm not a psychiatrist, but two, also because I think that those are more Eurocentric. I do know, however, that people in their own context, especially those who live in the community who are immersed in that social fabric are very easily able to pick up and talk about distress and also articulate it as such. Of course, like I said, the more marginalized you are, the harder it may be to talk about the distress that you are experiencing. So there is that. I don't know if I answered your question.
Bits and parts of it, of course, because I recently conducted a study, in a disaster-stricken area of UNICEF Bihar, and when you and these were all IDIs. Sadly, the population doesn't recognize, even they don't even wish to comment about these issues on a superficial level as well, because like I mentioned, the logistical challenges are so high that the public health challenges take a back seat. And unless and until you cater to the wash needs, the food security aspect, and the housing aspect, they would not even cater to the normal physical health challenges, let alone mental health challenges. So I just wanted to understand if you
I
have
think that's precisely the point, right? I'm saying that these must be looked at as a whole, because unless we look at access to sanitation, access to toilets, or food
yeah
insecurity for that matter, that has a further knock-on effect on mental health. So
yeah
sure, there is anxiety, uncertainty, fear, PTSD, maybe from a disaster. But if I don't um, provide mental health support alongside these basic needs, I'm going to just worsen the situation.
yeah Thank you, Raj. Thank you so much.
Sure. So I think there's a comment, which is, what I understand is rehabilitation of mental health, emotions, and happiness is more important than rebuilding infrastructure. Um, well, I'm saying that it's missing. A mental health lens in disaster response is missing, but social safety nets and infrastructure is as important. Um, Again, the whole idea is that we cannot look at mental health narrowly and say it's talk therapy or psychiatry. It has to move beyond and has to have linkages to other services if we are to engage with the intersection of climate change and mental health. And in case you're interested, I forgot to mention that we did have a journal last year that speaks about climate change and mental health. It's available for free on our website. You can take a look. And it documents a lot of what I spoke about.
Can I respond to it, please?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, it's a good discussion, and it's resilience, and it's recovery that has linked to these emotions and its well-being, and it's particularly mental health, other than the building of this is infrastructure. Okay, I agree also this is social infrastructure is more important than building on any civil infrastructure, because it's without happiness, without emotion, without minimizing stress, I think all kind of infrastructure that but it may not be fully fulfill the purpose of this happiness. And this is the very good discussion, and it is how the way we discuss this systemic risk and cascading disasters right now in this vulnerability or climate change. It is critical, and it is important to have a social protection, or this even if it's social infrastructure, rather than we can bring in it's all together, or it's interconnected program. We may call it is because it's one cannot, but it's all together. But which comes first, which comes last, that may decide. It's based on this, even if it's situation or this person, or even if it's I belong to Bhubaneswar. It's area is in its coastal Puri, and my name is Pradeep Mahapatra. I work with the organization called Udyam. We work with these communities, particularly resilience building. Thank you so much, and it's learning, and it's very inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Raj, one observation also and a question thereafter. An observation in terms of when we look at having a mental health and psychosocial lens, when we talk about agriculture, and when we look at the media reporting, when they talk about death by suicide amongst farmers, and they usually look at the mental health paradigm towards it, while not addressing and speaking much about the agrarian crisis that India is facing in a large number. One cannot really look at how that agriculture in India is the most riskiest trade. And by just labeling the farmer as some depression or some anxiety, that's what made them come inside, is the most reductionist attribute that one can take. So that is often the approach which the mainstream is taking up. And so would love to also hear your thoughts in terms of what can be done in terms of just removing this kind of reductionist approaches. The second is in terms of I think the novelty and the great shifts towards I think a cross-sectionality that you're promoting through your work. How level of I think fast forwardness or commitment have you seen from the government in institutionalizing these changes, of making them part of their own program implementation or program approaches?
Great question. You're absolutely right. That's why I was really stressing on the dominant approach being something that we really have to question. And you're absolutely right when it comes to farmer suicides. The pathologization of it as depression or anxiety helps no one. Now, if we take a look at suicide, it's actually, as a mental health person, I'll advocate that it needs to be like prized away a little bit from the talons of the mental health people, because it is a public health issue. It's very much an intersectional and intersectoral issue. And all of these, some of the factors that you mentioned are very germane to suicide prevention, right? And there are some resources out there. We have a report on suicide prevention that you may find informative when it comes to approaching such a topic. But staying on that topic, the government very recently launched a national suicide prevention strategy. Now they are showing very clear signs of at least recommending intersectional action that is not based in a pathologizing, not based in a biomedical model to this work. So I'll give you an example. As you said, farming is a dangerous profession. And in Tamil Nadu, there was a project that looked at farmer suicide and said, what are the ways in which, as a community, they can look at engaging with this phenomenon. And what they did is they said, let's look at the means of suicide, which is access to pesticide. Now, Sri Lanka went ahead and banned pesticides, and that created a whole bunch of issues for Sri Lanka. What this organization did was they got permission to use up like a community center in the village, and they created lockers. And each family put their pesticides, their stock of pesticides, inside a locker that was manned by a volunteer from the community. That caused a massive reduction in suicide. Again, community-based model, just stopping the person from accessing means of death had like a massive effect. And so I know that the government is looking through the NSPS to work on things like this. But overall, we have a very long way to go, simply because there are some very basic things that have not been implemented in our laws, in the Mental Health Care Act, in the DMHP work, as well as in our budgets. Unfortunately, the lion's share of our mental health budget, which is a very small portion of the overall health budget, that is going to tertiary institutions only. So while we do have some interesting policies and approaches, I'm yet to see much action towards actually making this a more systematic way to engage with concerns like those of the farmers. Okay, I know that there's some questions here. There are grants and partnership opportunities available with MHI. Our processes are hopefully transparent and open and available on our website. I think currently our grants are closed because we have a very high volume of grants to look at. What is for you the main gaps in research to help the action field in? I think the main gaps are honestly a lot of it is Eurocentric and Western dominated research and knowledge. Just even in terms of youth mental health and climate anxiety, youth mental health is the buzz in mental health now, and yet all the meetings I've attended on youth mental health and climate change have spoken about climate change that is something that's going to happen in the future. Now that's not true for most youth living in LMICs. Right. Some of the other gaps are, I think, which already people have spoken about, is mental health and workplace and occupational heat stress. I think is a very big one. Gig workers as well are facing it in India as we speak. Yes, Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies has pledged 100 crore to one of the very same institution, one of the two institutions that the government gives their money to. What, according to you, can be done by philanthropy to work in the intersection of climate change and mental health? I mean, I already spoke about my perspective building. I think if we build for the margins, we will cover everyone. If we start off at the center, that is at tertiary organizations and mental health institutions, we're going to take a very long time to reach the margins. There is a lot to be done. There is a lot of intersectional work to be done. Even in the area of education, education is so well resourced, and yet the only thing I'm hearing about is there climate change in our curricula. But what about the people, what about the kids who are living on the edge of the national highways in Assam because their homes have been destroyed due to extreme weather events? What is happening to their education? They're living through climate change. And what are we doing in terms of education to ensure that kids have uninterrupted education, right? Same thing with the livelihood, same thing with housing. I think there are just so many intersections, and honestly, like mental health, I believe that climate change also cuts across all of these intersections. Can you please share the link or source? Yes, I will share the link to the Tamil Nadu suicides. Interestingly, in terms of education as well, Tamil Nadu did a project where they allowed children from a certain standard to retake examinations, which caused a massive dent again in suicide rates of young people. But let me pull up the project. And
So,
in case there are more
yeah,
questions,
Raj, I have a
go
question
ahead.
actually. I'm Samir here,
Yeah.
and I have a question. Actually, I have worked with people with disabilities, special levels, and also worked with people who are basically in the mining sector in the forest area. And while working with them, what I have found is that I find that the major thing is the mindset issue, because I know that they are facing problem due to climate. For example, migrant laborers, they are staying in a very tough terrain, very hot, humid conditions, and the kids are also, they are migrating every year to some other places because of construction issues, and similar with the disability persons also. And due to a lot of floods and droughts, they have having issues actually. But while having a conversation with them, for them the primary thing is that financial stability. If they feel that if they are financially strong, if they are able to earn a livelihood, then anything that comes from environment or climate change, that becomes secondary. So how to bring those, how to make this also one of the important part when it comes to doing advocacy or creating awareness to those persons actually. Because sometimes they feel that, okay, now my only concern is to earn and to bring my livelihood. That is my only concern. And for them, first, anything that is happening from climate or something, that it is a temporary thing and things will work after some point of time. So how to create awareness and how to bring those part for the people who are working or staying, for example, in the forest area, in the tribal areas, in the mining areas, or similarly in the drought prone areas, or by the river bedside. I think where this ecological imbalances are happening, whether in terms of floods or droughts, is there. So just wanted to have your thoughts on this.
Sure. So, you're absolutely right. Livelihood concerns are a big part of it, whether it's migrant communities or people who live in forests, right? And then I'll ask you that what are the coping mechanisms that people use? Unfortunately, the most often used ones are substance dependency, and then it could be violence, it could be other things that the whole community as a whole is facing, right?
Right.
So in that case, the approach will always have to be twofold. One is obviously some amount of talk, support, therapy. And when I say therapy, I don't necessarily mean a psychologist. There's quite a few community mental health workers all over the country. People all over the world are now looking at community mental health as a good model, simply because nowhere in the world are there enough psychologists or psychiatrists. Let me already tell you that, right?
Yeah.
And community mental health is very effective because you are talking to someone in their language, you know their community. This is not something scary where I'm going to a clinic where someone is going to say, is something wrong with your head, right? Let's be real, there is like a lot of stigma around it, right?
Right.
So some community based talk support, but also alongside linkages to different government schemes, different social support schemes, social safety networks. Those are very important.
Yeah.
So there was another program tried in Indonesia as well as in Brazil, where they looked at giving cash transfers to people who are very vulnerable and affected, and that again, completely changed their lives, helped them with the distress, and also stopped suicide.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Samir. Thank you so much, Raj, again. Thank you for answering everyone's question very candidly, and we really appreciate your time. I hope the audience had a good and valuable session, and please do sign up for our future masterclasses as well.